Today, the Military Personnel Subcommittee will address the subject of military retirement, an issue of immense importance to service members and, in turn, to combat readiness. I want to thank Congressman Dr. Joe Heck for recommending that this subcommittee conduct this hearing. Dr. Heck very astutely recognized that military retirement would be a pivotal issue in the coming months, and that it was essential that this subcommittee address this issue expeditiously. Thank you, Dr. Heck, for your insight and call to action. The Defense Business Board, one element of the Department of Defense, was quick to present a major retirement reform proposal that set the tone of the retirement reform debate. The board's proposal would move the retirement system aggressively toward a private sector defined contribution system based on the personal investments of service members. The proposal received immediate criticism from service members and military associations. The proposal is certainly a radical solution that would result in a significant reduction of retired benefits for all service members. It could, as could be anticipated, the unveiling of the Defense Business Board proposal injected considerable uncertainty into the force, to include troops fighting in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The proposal created an immediate morale firestorm as service members feared that senior members within the Department of Defense and the military departments were seriously considering its implementation. We invited the Defense Business Board to testify today to face the arguments of their critics and explain the merits of their proposal, but they declined the invitation. I'm concerned that the Defense Business Board knowingly elected to pursue a very controversial proposal with immediate negative consequences for morale and combat readiness, and yet they were unwilling to come before this subcommittee and defend their actions. In my view, their failure to appear speaks volumes about their own lack of conviction that their proposal is deserving of serious consideration. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta has been clear that retirement reform must be on the table for consideration as the Department of Defense contemplates the wide array of programs that will be considered for cuts to meet the budget reduction goals. I am pleased that the Secretary understood the morale problem that had been created by the Defense Business Board and announced his clear support for grandfathering the benefits to be provided to currently serving service members who have borne the burden of war over the last 10 years. We simply cannot betray the trust of the service members who have performed with such courage and expertise in Afghanistan and Iraq. I was disappointed that Secretary Panetta did not disavow the Defense Business Board proposal. That statement would have removed a major irritant to the force. I was, however, very pleased at General Dempsey's statement before the House Armed Services Committee that recognized the unique requirements of military service and that strongly asserted that the military requires a retirement system totally different from any civilian retirement program. Today, we hope to learn more about the current positions of the Department of Defense and the military advocacy groups concerning the need to reform military retirement. I would like to welcome our witnesses, Dr. Joanne Rooney, the Principal Deputy Under Secretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. Dr. Rooney, this is your first opportunity to appear before the subcommittee. Welcome. I am certain we will be seeing more of you in the future. Next, we have two highly respected professionals that are longstanding friends of the subcommittee. Ms. Virginia S. Penrod, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Military Personnel Policy, and Colonel Stephen P. Strobridge, USAF, retired, the Director of Government Relations of the Military Officers Association of America, MOA. Finally, let me introduce Mr. John Davis. He is a Marine, not a Marine veteran or former Marine, a Marine. And so we appreciate so much you being here today. the Director of Legislative Programs, Fleet Reserve Association. Mr. Davis, this is also your first time as a witness before the subcommittee. Welcome. Congresswoman Davis, you are recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Rooney, welcome. I know that this is your first time testifying before the subcommittee, and so we're glad to have you. I also wanted to welcome Ms. Penrod, of course, and Colonel Strobridge, and Mr. Davis. Thank you all. I look forward certainly to hearing your comments on potential reform to the military retirement system. Well, we all know the concerns about the current state of our nation's economy. The discussions on the condition and the future of military retirement are once again being raised. No surprise, I would suggest. Such discussions are not new. During previous economic downturns, focus has turned to the sustainability and the affordability of our military retirement programs. However, for the most part, the current military retirement program was established over 60 years ago. So it is valid, I think, no matter how difficult. Certainly difficult knowing the nature of the service and the sacrifice of the men and women who serve. It's still appropriate, I think, for us to ask ourselves whether the current program still meets the requirements it was set up to achieve, which of course we know is the focus of today's hearings. Only 17% of the force actually completes a full 20 years of service in order to qualify for a non-disability retirement. And many have expressed concerns that the current program does not recognize the sacrifices of those who serve during 10 years of conflict and may not stay the full 20 years to earn a retirement. Is it fair that that person who may have been deployed once and stays to retirement is eligible for a lifetime benefit, while an individual who may have multiple deployments in a combat theater does not stay 20 years, that person walks away with nothing more than the admiration of a grateful nation? When the 20-year retirement program was established, the life expectancy in 1949 for a white male was 66.2 years. For a black male, it was 58.9 years. Compared to the latest data available, the life expectancy in 2009 for a white male is 76.2 years, and for a black male, 70.9 years. So there's no doubt that Americans are living longer and more fuller lives, which means that an average individual who receives military retirement for 20 years of service will receive retirement for nearly twice as long in his adult life, him or her adult life. In addition, many of those who retire at 20 years of service have gone on with an ability to seek another full career in a different field. Changes to the personnel compensation programs, including the retirement system, often strikes fear in the force. So it is important, critically important, that we do not necessarily undermine the faith of those who are currently serving. But we do have a responsibility to ensure that the compensation package that is provided to service members are meeting the needs of our nation's national security, and that, of course, includes looking at the military retirement package. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing, and I look forward to our witnesses testifying today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Davis. I ask unanimous consent that the Defense Business Board report on their proposal to reform military retirement and a statement from the Reserve Officers Association be entered into the hearing record. Hearing no objection, so ordered. And at this time, we'll proceed in order with our witnesses, beginning with Dr. Rooney.
Good afternoon. Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Davis, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to come before you on behalf of the women and men who so ably serve in our nation's armed forces. I am here today to speak to you about the military retirement system of our uniformed services. Since the military transitioned to an all-volunteer force, military compensation has been under continuous scrutiny. The primary goals of the military compensation system are to attract, retain, and eventually separate members so the United States forces can support the numerous missions both here and abroad, and when called upon, succeed on the battlefield. Even though some consider military benefits far-reaching, we must remain cognizant that they support the brave men and women who volunteered to defend this great nation. Over time, while the military retirement system has remained relatively constant, pensions in the private sector have changed and more closely aligned to support the more mobile workforce in that sector. Unlike the private sector, the military services must grow most of their military workforce internally. It generally takes 15 to 20 years to develop the next generation of infantry battalion commanders and submarine captains. As a result, the department must ensure military compensation, promotions, and personnel policies all foster greater retention and longer careers necessary to create these experienced leaders. This need for greater longevity and continuity suggests there are valid reasons why mirroring a private sector compensation package may not necessarily be the proper approach for the military. However, the department does believe that reviewing the retirement system is both a fair and reasonable endeavor, and over the past year has begun reviewing such retirement in the context of a total military compensation system. The officer, enlisted and civilian leadership of all services, from the active duty, reserve, and National Guard components, as well as the U.S. Coast Guard, are participating in this review. The review is designed to be deliberate, careful, and pragmatic. The Defense Business Board proposal is just one of several concepts that are being reviewed and modeled to determine the impact on recruitment and retention. The department is working to strike the correct balance. This includes weighing the impact of a new system on recruiting and retention, considering the welfare of the individual service members and families, which includes grandfathering our existing force who took their oath under the current system, and acknowledging our responsibility to the American taxpayer. The department needs to ensure any proposed changes do not break faith with the current members or negatively impact the current force. Before proposing changes to the military retirement system or any part of the military pay and benefit structure, however, the department is committed to conducting significant evaluation and in-depth analysis of any proposal. The department must ensure its ability to continue recruiting and retaining the highest quality members, and must understand to the fullest extent possible the impact of any changes on the future of the all-volunteer force. Finally, while the department acknowledges the military retirement system appears expensive, it is neither unaffordable nor spiraling out of control as some would contend. The department annually contributes amounts to the Military Retirement Fund in accordance with the requirements set forth by the DoD Office of the Actuary. The contributions as a percentage of military basic pay are projected to remain relatively constant over time. At this time, the department does not have any specific proposals or recommendations ready to offer. Within the last month, the President recommended forming a commission to review the military retirement system. If this commission is formed, the department expects to provide significant input to the commission. The department also expects that any proposals offered will be similarly presented to the Congress and to this subcommittee for discussion and assessment. I look forward to continuing to work with each of you as the department moves ahead on this issue, and thank you again for the opportunity to testify and for your continued support of our military members and their families. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Rooney. We now proceed to Ms. Penrod.
Good afternoon. Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Davis, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to come before you to discuss the military retirement system for our uniformed services. Dr. Rooney told you that the department has begun a review of military retirement, and it is my office that's been tasked with this tremendously important undertaking. The purpose is to determine the impact and feasibility of restructuring the statutory and policy framework for military retirement. We are aware numerous commissions and studies have criticized the retirement system. However, I would like to point out that the current system has supported the most successful all-volunteer force in the world. The question now is whether the current system is still relevant in today's environment. If not, Should it be modified to meet future requirements and in a manner more in line with the private sector? To ensure that we are, in doing our review, we get it right, we are considering the major aspects of military pay and benefits, along with the associated personnel and force management policies that have an impact on recruiting and retaining the all-volunteer force. We're not looking at retirement in isolation. Our work is not yet complete, so I'm unable to report to you on the results of the review. However, I can assure you that sustaining the all-volunteer force and the men and women that so ably serve our nation will be at the heart of whatever we do. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Penrod. And Colonel Strobridge.
Thank you for this opportunity to present our views on military retirement concerns. We're grateful to the committee for standing up as champions, both now and in the past, to ensure military retirement incentives remain commensurate with the extraordinary demands of career service. The primary purpose of the military retirement package is to induce top-quality people to serve multiple decades under conditions few Americans are willing to endure for even one term. After a decade of war in which career service members deployed time after time after time, with ever-increasing odds of coming home a changed person, we find it shockingly insensitive that some now seek to curtail their retirement package to, quote, make it more like civilian workers. These are the primary incentives that have sustained the career force in peace and war. We're very concerned the recent proposals are aimed mainly at achieving budget savings with scant regard for longer-term damage to retention and readiness. The fact is we already have considerable history with military retirement cutbacks. Enactment of the high three-year average basic pay system in 1980 cut retired pay by about 8% for subsequent entrants. Through the 1980s and 1990s, military pay raises were capped below private sector pay growth nearly every year, dramatically reducing lifetime retired pay for all the thousands of people who retired under those depressed pay tables. And in 1986, Congress passed the so-called Redux retirement system that cut lifetime retired pay value by more than 25% for a 20-year military retiree. At that time, Secretary Weinberger, Secretary of Defense at the time, warned Congress that Redux would inevitably undermine retention and readiness, which proved true a decade later, and Congress repealed it in 1999. Recent proposals by the Defense Business Board and the 10th Quadrennial Review of Military Compensation envision far more dramatic cutbacks than Redux did, delaying most retirement compensation until age 57 or 60, even though the services don't want to keep most people anywhere near that long. Both also propose a vesting option for people who choose to leave early. We believe this is a formula for retention and readiness disaster that would have destroyed the career force had it been in effect over the past 10 years. Some support vesting on a principle of fairness with private sector workers, but it's an odd concept of fairness indeed that would dramatically cut compensation for those who serve and sacrifice the longest to pay more for those who leave early. Defense leaders have sought to quell concern in the field by saying they plan to grandfather the current force. But the Redux experience proved that grandfathering doesn't avoid adverse retention effects. It only shifts them to the laps of future leaders. And in contrast to Secretary Weinberger's dire warnings about Redux threat to future readiness, current defense leaders have repeatedly expressed support for significant retirement cutbacks for future entrants without a word about long-term retention risks. In our view, that's an abdication of their responsibility to protect future as well as current readiness. We're extremely grateful that this subcommittee and the full subcommittee have stood up to highlight those retention and readiness concerns to the supercommittee when few others seemed so inclined. That concludes my portion of the coalition statement, sir.
Thank you very much, Colonel. And now we proceed to Lieutenant Davis.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important issue. The all-volunteer force has successfully fought a protracted war due primarily to the dedication and patriotism of our men and women in uniform. But we should not underestimate the pay and benefits keeping the force sustained during this time of challenge. Many wrongly believe that the uniformed service has received 50% of pay for 20 years of service, but that is not the reality. The retired pay calculation is based solely on the basic pay, excluding housing and subsistence allowances. Personnel with 20 years of service earned retired pay that replaces 34 to 37% of their gross cash pay and allowances. Any fair share accounting should acknowledge retirees that have already given under the past budget cuts. Hundreds of thousands retired under depressed pay tables between the mid-1980s and the mid-2000s. They have already forfeited $3,000 to $5,000 a year for the rest of their lives. Regarding the changed CPI, some economists believe that the Consumer Price Index overstates inflation by failing to recognize that consumers change their behavior when prices rise sharply. When that happens, they say, people simply buy cheaper substitute products, such as chicken instead of beef, when the price rises. It's more complicated with other substitutes. Is a compact car a substitute for a full-size car? Over time, this leads to a major change in living patterns. The changed CPI would reduce lifetime retired pay for an E7 with 20 years of service by $100,000. The TMC opposes any kind of COLA cuts because that violates the very purpose of COLAs, to protect against erosion of benefits by inflation. Another proposal is to use the high 5 in lieu of the current high 3. This would cut retired pay by 6% over 4 years. We oppose this because it is just another way to devalue military service. The 10th QRMC report suggests a 401k type retirement payment starting at age 57 to 60. This would reduce retired pay for an E7 with 20 years of service from $24,000 a year, already a modest amount, to a ridiculous $3,600 a year. This dramatic change would do grave harm for retention and recruiting. A recent FRA survey indicates that 90% of respondents believe that if benefits were delayed until age 60, fewer people would join and they would serve shorter periods of time. The survey also indicates that more than 80% would leave the military sooner if military retirement was switched to a 401k plan, and 84% believe fewer people would join. Career senior NCOs are the backbone of our military, and their leadership guidance are invaluable as a result of many years of experience. Civilianizing benefits likely result in many of them leaving the military early, and these positions are very difficult to replace. But the bottom line is the current retirement system is that it has worked as intended, sustaining a quality career force through good and bad budget times, through war and peace. It only stopped working after Congress cut it back in 1986, and that's a lesson we shouldn't have to relearn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll proceed now, and each member will have a 5-minute period of asking questions. And again, we have a person above reproach, Mike Higgins, who's going to be our timekeeper. And so you can almost look at his face and tell when the 5 minutes is up. I'd like to begin with Dr. Rooney and Ms. Penrod. It's been widely reported that with the Defense Business Board reform proposal last summer, that there was a great deal of distress among career service members. DOD's reluctance to disavow the proposal has given rise to concern that there's strong support at DOD for such reforms. With this report, does DOD intend to support the Defense Business Board proposal? And then it's already been identified by both of you that there are studies underway as to how this proposal will affect retention. When should we expect a report on the effect on retention?
Yes, sir. In regards to our posture on the Defense Business Board. You indicated that early on we did not come out adamantly against it, but I believe that recent statements by the Secretary, the Chairman, and even in our opening statements clearly indicated that we are seeing the Defense Business Board proposal as just one data point for consideration in review as we're looking at the overall retirement and compensation system. Again, the key factor for us is that any change or any system, frankly, must ensure that we are able to recruit and retain the all-volunteer force and not at all damage the current faith that the troops have in us. So that report has some very strong limitations. It is a data point for us, and we see it just as that, as a data point. You also asked, where are we in terms of a proposal coming forward? And as Ms. Penrod indicated, we have a group that's currently looking at a number of alternatives, and we are working closely with the RAND Corporation to also help us in the analysis of that, again, with the idea that recruiting and retention are key factors to consider in any kind of proposal. So at this point, we don't have a specific date. However, with the President's proposed commission, if that would stand up in the springtime, should that go forward, we would be prepared at that point in time to be very much informing the conversation with them.
And Ms. Penrod?
Yes, as Dr. Rooney stated, we're working with RAND to model any proposals or changes to the current retirement program. We preliminarily have the final report of the DBB, and it does have a negative impact on retention. That's what it's showing us at this time. We're not complete with that review, but again, as Dr. Rooney stated, it is a data point, and we will take that report and it will inform as our review goes along.
Thank both of you, and I was very impressed, Colonel and Mr. Davis, the facts that you pointed out. People should know how this affects individuals. And with that in mind, what is your reaction that the retirement reform is unavoidable because it's fiscally unsustainable? What would be your response, each of you?
The testimony we've heard here today from the DOD witnesses kind of refutes that, where they said it's neither spiraling out of control nor unsustainable. Their projection is that it's going to be about the same percentage of basic pay into the future. I think the committee has statistics that shown that retirement costs as a percentage of the DOD budget have been relatively stable over time. The first time where I worked on military retirement was in 1977, and we showed projections at that time that critics were pointing out that it was going to be, the system would go broke by the year 2000. Well, we're still here, and we just fought a war since the year 2000, so I kind of poo-poo those kinds of ideas.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Well, I would certainly agree with everything Colonel Strober just said, and I would just add that the price of military retirement, price of military benefits is really part of the cost of fighting a war that we're currently involved with, and the price of defending our nation, and should be put in that category as well.
And I want to thank all of you as I conclude, because I can see your appreciation of the career NCOs, the junior officers. We can, quote, get new recruits, but the expertise must be maintained for the security of our country, of our NCOs and junior officers. Proceed to Congresswoman Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you all for being here. I wonder if you could address the issue of fairness. As I mentioned in my opening statement, that we have certainly hundreds, thousands of our military personnel who serve out the 20 years, though they may only deploy once, if at all, in a conflict theater, versus those who deploy on many occasions. Certainly, we know in the last 10 years that's quite common, and yet do not serve the full 20 years. How do you think we should go about looking at that issue? And do you think it's one of fairness, or is it, just the way it is?
I'll be happy to
Dr.
take
Rooney,
a
do you
shot
want
at
to start,
that.
or that's fine for all of you.
to me, the key purpose on the retirement system is sustaining the career force. National defense comes first. I'm all in favor of fairness. I've built my career on arguing issues of fairness. But you have to sustain the system through peace and war, through good budget times, through bad budget times. And we all have seen periods in the past where we've pulled out all the stops to retain people. When we've had service conditions so terrible or an economy that was so strong that we had to raise retention bonuses, we had to pay, extra things. Those are going to happen in the future as well. And when we acknowledge that the military service conditions are unique and vastly different from civilian conditions, the fact that we can only get 17% of enlisted people to stay for the current system, to me, speaks for itself about the arduousness of the career and the few people who are willing to endure that for a long time. To then turn around and say, but we need to pay more to people who leave, to me, anytime you have a vesting system, it by definition detracts from a career incentive. It can't do anything else. And in bad budget times, it leaves the government bidding against itself for their services, which only drives up costs. So to me, if you want to talk fairness, the first thing we have to do is be fair to the people who suffer and sacrifice the longest, and that's the career person. And the last thing we should be doing is cutting their package to fund a better package for people who leave.
Dr. Rooney, did you want?
Certainly. When we're looking at fairness, and you brought up a good point because you were even talking about the range of people and deployments and all, and that's why in my opening statement, and you've heard other comments from the Department of Defense, that we look at compensation as a total package, of which retirement is only one segment of it. So across that, whether it's basic pay, hazardous duty pay, imminent danger pay, all of the different aspects that go into compensation, that's how we get that balance of fairness. The other thing in terms of the overall system for fairness is when people come into the military, they understand the system. They come in knowing what the various pieces are, and as a result, they're feeling, because we're viewing it from not only basic pay, but all the tenets of compensation up to retirement, that we do get a balance of fairness. The point you did bring up, though, in terms of should we be adding a component to retirement to compensate for those people less than 20 years, that's one of the reasons that we're saying it's very prudent to be looking at military retirement as part of the overall compensation to determine if, in fact, there is something in that aspect that we need to look at more closely.
Thank you. And in the little time left, if Mr. Davis, did you want to comment? I thought.
Yes, I just wanted to point out that we did a survey, and that was one of the questions that we asked 350 active duty personnel. Do you think it's fair for people that, to get a pension, you have to serve 20 years, and 81% of them thought it was fair. So, in the ranks of the military, apparently, there's no feeling that, gee, if I serve 10 years and get out, it's unfair because someone else serves 20 years and they get a pension and I get nothing. And I also would like to just point out, too, that it's not under the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, but if someone serves 10 or 12 years, of course, they're then under the jurisdiction of the Veterans Committee, and they do have benefits, of course, such as the GI Bill and a whole latitude of things that they can use to get benefits from their service.
All right. Thank you. Yes. Ms. Penrod, did you want to comment?
I think I agree with you, Congresswoman Davis, that it is a 20-year retirement has sustained the all-volunteer force, but I believe we should look at it. We have a different cohort coming in every year. How do we know what the future will look like, what people are looking for in a retirement system? It may make the military more enticing to come in if an individual thinks that they may have something they could take with them. Also, even though you have the GI Bill, I think that's an outstanding benefit. You still have an individual that will be separated possibly during drawdown with 12 years of service. And so I think we need to look at that, and that's what we're going to do, is look at the whole program.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And we proceed to Mr. Kaufman of Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my first question is, I think some of the testimony today had referenced what that it's a relatively low percentage of payroll that supports the retirement system, but nobody said what that is, and I'm wondering if somebody could give me a percentage number.
At this point, we have some of the numbers. I'd like to take that for the record, please, sir.
Very well. You know, I just think that first of all, I agree with the Secretary of Defense when he testified before the House Armed Services Committee recently, and he said that if we do, whatever reforms we do should not affect those who are currently on active duty, and went in with the understanding that this is what the system is when they in fact enlisted or were commissioned in the armed forces of the United States. However, with that said, and myself being a retiree from kind of an active duty and reserve combination, that I remember as I was approaching the 20th year mark, and when you're a reservist and if you're injured, not when you're on active duty, it's not considered line of duty. Not misconduct would be the category, and you don't fall into that. You report back for duty. I was in the Marine Corps Reserve in that weekend, and if you're determined that you can't do what they asked you to do because you've sustained an injury skiing, then you're automatically out, and there's nothing there for you. And I gave up skiing in Colorado as I got close to that 20-year mark, just to make sure that nothing happened there as I got close to that. I just think that we need to take a look at, not so much the reservists, but I think the active duty component. And I disagree with the notion that we ought to go in the direction of all defined contribution. I just think that we're asking our service members to give a lot. And I think that there needs to be a component of certainty in that. So perhaps a more bifurcated approach that would be defined benefit with an element of defined contribution for those who would enter the armed forces after the effective date of the new system when it was put in place. So I just think that this system needs to be reformed. It needs to be revised. It's something my father, was under the system as a retired Army Master Sergeant who was a World War II and Korean veteran, and I think that as Congresswoman Davis has said, things certainly have changed since then in terms of life expectancies and a number of other issues. So I just think that everything we ought to look at. But I understand if the Defense Advisory Board only looked at one issue, if I understand that, only came across with one suggestion, and that was just completely defined contribution. Is that my understanding?
Yes, that's the only proposal we've seen is one that is a defined contribution.
Yeah, I'm surprised by that and disappointed by that. I just think that I mean, if you look at the system for federal civil service or for members of Congress, I think for members of Congress and their staffs, it's 1.7% a year for the first 20 years. It's 1% thereafter for the next 10 years. And there's a thrift savings plan, which is the defined contribution part, which is there for all federal employees. And it's a lower, I think, factor. I can't remember what it is for federal employees. But the difference between federal employees and the military, or members of Congress, if you will, and I'm not a fan of our retirement system, I think it ought to go, but for the military is the fact that they don't have, and we don't really want them to have, the sort of career protections that federal civil service has. And so when you compare the two retirement systems, I think you need to recognize that in the military system. And it has to complement the fact that they're all at-will employees when making determinations about retirement. So I look forward to working with you, all of you, in terms of coming up with a new system. I'm certainly not going to say that the old system ought to be replicated going forward. I don't believe that. But coming up with a new system. And I do believe that we need to look at, in particular, those folks that serve less than 20 years, that I think that they ought to accrue something for that. And I think we ought to in the new system, again, for those who are not members of the armed forces yet, I think we ought to look at the notion that should you begin drawing the defined benefit portion of your retirement right at the end of the 20-year mark or whatever the mark is. So I think that there are a number of issues that ought to be on the table. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. We now proceed to Congressman Dr. Joe Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I especially want to thank you for pulling this hearing together so quickly after my request. I want to thank all the panelists for being here today and providing your testimony. You know, I agree that it's certainly reasonable to review the pay and benefits and the retirement system of our armed services, but where I disagree is when the Defense Business Board's proposal is released publicly without much information given to our men and women who are currently serving in harm's way. And then I received the emails and phone calls from folks wondering what's going on with their potential retirement and hearing firsthand what the impact was on morale in theater. Not that they're not already worried enough about whether or not they're going to get their next paycheck back home so their wife can make the mortgage, but now they're worried about what's going to happen when they hit their 20-year mark and what's going to go on with their potential retirement. You know, the question of is the current benefits package or the current retirement relevant, I think poses a concern in that how do you define relevance? You know, and I hope that that's not a euphemism for the cost associated with the retirement program, especially when only 17% of the folks who spend their lifetime in, enter the service wind up qualifying for a full retirement. I know it's hard enough under these fiscal times when we're trying to figure out how Department of Defense is going to meet the $450 billion reductions over 10 years that this administration has already called for. But is this review of benefits and pay taking place in a vacuum, or is it being looked at in conjunction with the amounts that we spend on basing and facilities and the amount that we're spending on hardware and weapon systems, or is each one of these things being reviewed in a silo? Because my concern is we can have the best piece of equipment, the best weapon system, but if we don't have the person to gain the sight picture or pull the trigger, like the great pilots I have at Creech Air Force Base manning the RPAs now in theater, that weapon system really doesn't do anything. So is this being done in a vacuum, or is it being looked at across the board in the entire DoD budget?
Sir, I'll be happy to comment on that. No, it is not being looked at in a vacuum. We are looking at, as you said, the challenge that we have for budget cuts, but as not just across the board cuts or arbitrary cuts, but very strategically looking to what does our future force need to look like, and how then, once we determine that future force, how do we attract and retain the best people using compensation as the tool to be able to, again, support that all-volunteer force, keep our current troops the faith of them, but also going forward, attract and retain. So it is part of an overall strategic look at how we're going to face not only the budget challenges, but our challenges as a Department of Defense going forward.
Well, and I appreciate what Colonel Strobridge stated, having lived through the years of having to give recruitment bonuses or incentive bonuses and then using stop-loss to keep people in. And now we're getting to the point where we're cutting the active duty force in both the Army and the Marine Corps. So how does that play into this decision? I mean, we're already trying to downsize the force on purpose. And now we're talking about potentially changing the retirement program, which may cause an additional exodus.
Actually, sir, when I was indicating strategic, I do mean we are taking into consideration that we are doing a force drawdown, but we're also looking forward and acknowledging that in addition to keeping faith with our current forces, we will be recruiting new forces going forward. You mentioned some specific capabilities at Creech. So that is part of the area that we know our forces for the future will rely on new technologies, and we may have new requirements for recruiting those folks. So as we're looking at what does this force look like, what are the attributes, we just want to make sure that our overall compensation package, of which the retirement is one, is the right combination of package. And that's why we're saying that there is no decision that has been made on any component of that. But as the Secretary has said several times, we must put everything on the table because that is the prudent way to approach this challenge.
And in my limited time, just a quick final question. Has there been set a dollar figure that is supposed to be attained either in retirement or overall in paying benefits and trying to help balance the DoD budget?
Not a specific one.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, thank you for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Doctor. We proceed to Congressman Allen West of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Madam Ranking Member as well, and thanks for the panel for being here. And I guess I'm one of those guys that the Ranking Member talked about that did do a career in the military and was young enough to continue on to have a second career, which is kind of a laughable hypocrisy in that 22 years in the United States military active duty, I got a 55% retirement, and I believe in 5 years on this side I could get vested into an even greater retirement, so we can talk about that later. But as I sit here today, I am very concerned, and it takes me back to the quote by George Washington, where George Washington talked about how future generations will regard their service to this nation based upon how well we treat our veterans. And I recall my father, who was a World War II veteran, sitting down and talking to me about how great it would be to serve a career in the military. So when I look at a career in the military, when I look at people that are serving in our military, that is a defined contribution. And on the backside, I think that we should be giving them a defined benefit for that contribution because of what they do. Now, my first question is, do we still have the thrift savings program, the thrift savings plan for those men and women out there who, may just serve, 5 years, and while they're in a combat theater, they're allowed to go into that thrift savings plan so they can start putting away some money?
Yes, Congressman West, we continue to have the thrift savings plan.
Okay. Now, when we talk about comparing military service to the civilian sector, does the private sector, civilian sector have something that's equal to the Uniform Code of Military Justice?
No, sir, they do not.
Okay. In the private sector, other than being a professional athlete, does your position and your ability to progress through the ranks depend on your physical abilities, and do we mandate that people have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning regardless of the conditions thereof to participate in physical training and activity?
Well, Congressman, I cannot comment on private sector employment. However, I can say that I think we all agree that the sacrifices are not the same for our military personnel as they are for our private sector civilians.
And I think that's my biggest concern, is that what we ask the men and women to do ever since those men answered the call of arms at Lexington and Concord is different from someone just going to a bank, or different from someone even coming here to work on Capitol Hill. So it's a very dangerous road when we start to go down the comparative analysis of the private sector or business sector to the United States military. So I ask that we be very careful about that, because I think that we're already starting to make some decisions thereof. How many people in the panel do you remember what happened after Desert Shield, Desert Storm, when we all of a sudden offered people money to exit the United States military? I do. Have you all done any research as far as the degradation of leadership, which is something that General Martin Dempsey talked about when he came and testified before us a couple of weeks ago? Have we looked at that and what could happen as far as the progression of leadership?
Yes, I believe General Dempsey used the term hollowing of the force, and the Secretary has also talked about that is something we have learned many lessons from the past, and we will not do anything to our compensation system so that we end up with that hollowed force.
Okay. Any comments, Colonel?
I would just like to say I know what you're saying about that, and that from the enlisted side, you have senior enlisted people, sergeant major, whatever.
You need first sergeants and sergeant majors.
To nothing else. Those people combined with the junior officers who have hard charging junior officer. But you also have a senior enlisted person who can have a wealth of experience with the military, 20 or 30 years, that they can explain things to the junior officer, can call on them for their experience, and that makes a very powerful combination.
And I will testify to that as a young, stupid second lieutenant when I first came in. Colonel, you have anything you want to add?
Yes, sir. I think so many of these things and these analyses treat people in the context of, quote, human resources, as if they were widgets in a box, instead of thinking, planning human beings. And when we model, I've got a lot of, they're doing a lot of studies working with RAND. I've spent a lot of time working with RAND. The problem with all these is the models don't include things you can't quantify, such as sacrifice, such as time away from home. They include everything, all the money people spend. They can measure behavior, but they don't talk about, there's nothing in the model that accommodates the chance that we might go to war tomorrow. And you might be going to Iraq every other year for the next 10 years. There's nothing in there that accommodates for the fact that we might do the opposite. We might stop a war, we might have a budget-driven drawdown, and you've built your plans on staying for a career, and all of a sudden we're going to force you out. And those are the kinds of things that, service leaders are always seeking additional flexibility to be able to micromanage the force. And the only thing we know about those kinds of plans is whatever you plan for 5 or 10 years is going to be wrong because the world is going to change your plan for you. And to us, that is one thing when you have a very powerful career incentive like the 20-year retirement plan, it's very resistant to day-to-day manipulation. And that's a good thing.
Thank you. And I just hope that our fiscal irresponsibility on this side does not become borne on the backs of our men and women in uniform or their families. And with that being said, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And Congressman Scott of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to focus more on the gentleman, ladies, with my questions, if I may. And I'd like to focus, if we could, on the 80%, 83% that get nothing. And Colonel, you were just talking about the potential of somebody to go overseas every other year for the next 10 years, 5 tours, and then you have a drawdown or a force reduction. And the bottom line is that person would not qualify. Even though they may have wanted to stay for 20 years, they would get nothing. Is that correct?
I don't think that's correct. When we have these kinds of drawdowns, for example, Congressman West was talking about what happened in the 90s. We had very special programs to provide additional incentives to try to entice people to separate voluntarily. For people with 15 to 19 years, Congress authorized an early retirement program. As difficult as those things are, that was probably the best example of the kind of thing that can be done. Now the challenge is the drawdown that's coming up in this fiscal environment. I think it's going to be a lot tougher for Congress to authorize those kinds of programs. So we are going to be seeing less incentives. There will be some incentives, but probably less.
Of the 17% who receive the benefits from the 20 years, what percentage of them are enlisted?
This
17% of the men and women
of the people who
qualify.
stay for a career?
Right.
What percentage are enlisted? Probably about 70%, I would think.
So okay. So 70% are enlisted. I guess my question is, I hear your objection to having, you object to having any other plan. Is that correct?
No, I don't object to having any other plan. I object on the face of it to saying that because civilians do these things, that the military should too. The military is a very different system. It's built to serve a very different purpose. And so to me, it has to start with that uniqueness and not assume that what happens in the private sector is in any piece is a good thing. It needs to be evaluated on its own merits.
I certainly agree with you that they're different, but I do think that it's necessary for this committee and for us as a Congress to do something that helps that 83% who don't qualify under the 20 years. And there are many of them that have served many tours overseas, and I understand that we have to have our experience in our officers and maintaining those things. But I'll tell you, I do think that we need to remember those 83% of people who have spent their time and their families' time and contributed a great deal to the freedoms that we enjoy in this country. And I see nothing wrong with them being free to choose a different retirement plan on their own will. So we'll work on that as time goes on. I would ask Mr. Davis, would you give me that math again on that you used, where you said 3,000 was the last number and maybe 24,000 was the first in your presentation?
That was the 24,600 for an E7 with 20 years, as compared to the taking the plan proposed by the 10th QRMC, which was to put them in a 401k after, but they wouldn't be able to get that till age 57 to 60, and I believe it came out to $3,600 a year, the 401k benefit.
How many years would they have contributed to that 401? Could you just share that math with the committee? I'd like to.
If I could clarify that
calculation.
He's referring to a chart that we made. The 3,600 would be the initial value of the defined benefit retired pay. In other words, the 24,000 would be reduced by 5% for each year the person left before age 57. Okay. And assuming an enlisted person leaves at age 40, that means it would be reduced 85%. So the defined benefit contribution, or the defined benefit portion, would be $3,600 a year. There would be some additional amount that person would receive from their thrift savings plan that would be in the range of $10,000 to $13,000 that they could start drawing at age 60.
But that would be contingent upon how much money they put into the thrift savings plan. If I could see that math on that, I'd just like to. I'd like to see the math on that.
Yes, sir.
That calculation.
We have a chart on that in our formal statement. I can get it to you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now proceed to Congresswoman Hartzler of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Davis. Appreciate all of you being here. I wanted to start, if I could, with Colonel, and ask you to expound a little bit more on your comment earlier that you don't think grandfathering in, if there was a new plan, you don't support having a new plan and just grandfathering in current members of the military. And could you expound on your concerns?
Sure. I think my point was people look at grandfathering as a panacea, that everything will be okay as long as we grandfather the current force. I have a letter, the letter that I referred to that Caspar Weinberger wrote back in 1985 that went to Tip O'Neill expressing concern about the Redux plan Congress was about to enact. And that letter spoke very eloquently on grandfathering. If you don't mind, I'd like to read it for a moment. It says, while the changes we have been required to submit technically affect only future entrants, we expect an insidious and immediate effect on the morale of the current force. No matter how the reduction is packaged, it communicates the same message. That is, the perception that there is an erosion in support from the American people for the servicemen and women for whom we call upon to ensure our safety. It says in absolute terms that the unique and dangerous and vital sacrifices they routinely make are not worth the taxpayers' dollars they receive, which is not overly generous. Now, the issue, there was a line in there where he said, basically, you have two categories of people serving side by side who each know that they have different benefits. And that was a very accurate predictor of what happened in the 90s, where you have the people who are trying to re-enlist people say either they mislead them and tell them what the benefit they have, which when the people find out that that wasn't true, they get particularly upset, or you have these people saying, I'm sorry, but the benefit you have is not what your predecessors have. there is just no way, as those people go through 20 years serving together, that that doesn't become a burr under their saddle.
Okay, so you're not for any changes at all? You want to keep the system the way it is now forever? Is that right?
It's probably not realistic to say there will never be any changes at all. The thing that I think we would have to, and very frankly, there would probably end up being budget-driven changes of some type. I think we have to start from the standpoint that we have tried some of these things before. The one that we know was a tragic failure was the Redux system, which compared to the things that are on the table today was pretty modest.
All right. Could I hear from the Department of Defense representatives on why you initiated this whole process? What is, why do you think there needs to be some changes? What's the rationale?
It's actually multiple purpose. One is that we are looking to our future force. And again, we talked about such concepts as we don't want to hollow out the force as we're changing. We know we're facing drawdowns. We also know that our future force very much can look different in terms of the type of force we must recruit, the qualifications, the technical aspects. So right there, as we're doing that review, that prompted us to say, are we sure we have the correct pay, benefits, compensation package going forward? The timing of that review and not only the speed but the deliberateness of it clearly ties into our budget concerns going forward and the budget that we must meet and the reductions we must meet. So all of that is coming together at the same time, and again, because we're trying to view all of the budget reductions strategically and as though they're interconnected, this does become part of that discussion but is not solely driven because it's a budget exercise.
Okay. I wanted to jump to a concern that I've heard at home and see if any discussion is taking place with this. There's about 30 seconds left. But is there any incentive currently in the system, which I don't believe there is, to encourage people to stay 30 years? Some of the concerns I've heard from some of my retired military at home is that right now we have many people retiring at 20 years and we're losing that knowledge and all that experience. So is there anything being looked at to encourage people to stay longer?
Actually, as we look at our review, we look at the whole force profile and agree the 20-year retirement pulls people to 20 and it's cliff vested. And the force today of the services, they built their force profile around that behavior. We do have, you continue to earn 2.5 percentage points for every year you stay in the military, up to 100% or over 100%. So we do have changes that happened several years ago as far as retirement. But that will be part of the overall review. We have a model, as Steve said, RAND has a very strong model to look at the impacts on retention, but that just informs the process. We also have our senior enlisted advisors are part of the working group. All services are represented, Coast Guard's represented, Guard and Reserve are represented. So that's where you have that humanist piece of this review and the experience.
Thank you. And I just can encourage all of you as you go through this process to continue to get input from as many people as possible affected by this, as well as members of Congress. It's just, this is a very, very important topic to certainly people in my district, but to our national security. And so no changes should be made lightly, obviously. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for the input, and thank you for your service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You have another question? Thank you, Ms. Harsler. Ms. Davis, do you have another question?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't sure if we were going to have another round, but there are a few questions, and one is really to Mr. Strobridge and Mr. Davis. I know how difficult this is in getting input from all the people who you speak to, but I'm wondering within this discussion whether there are really some priorities perhaps that have been identified, whether there were some areas in which you feel that you could find savings. Can you prioritize any of the benefits for us? What should be protected? What could be modified, reduced, or eliminated? Acknowledging, of course, that we that you'd rather not see any reductions at all, and that even the targeting here is problematic. But are there some areas in which you could define for the committee that might be helpful?
I think one thing you have to recognize is we are here representing 34 organizations, and that does require a wide diversity. We did have some differences of opinions on health care, on the TRICARE fees. In the end, and the kinds of differences we were talking about were $5 a month, and those were very significant within the coalition. We had a lot of debates over those, whether we should just say no changes. I think there are a reasonable number of groups that would say no changes. The system works. This is what people were promised. We had to stick with it. I think there are people who would be willing to discuss those things, but I think that is much tougher on retirement, very frankly, than health care. And even health care, when we were talking about that, we were talking about relatively small differentials. The kinds of things in health care that are on the table now, which were very disappointing to us, who did buy into a $2 increase on pharmacy fees, to then have the administration turn around before that even gets enacted and say, you know what, no, we're going to raise that to $40. That's a big problem. And that raises some serious credibility issues that, give, support to the idea that give an inch, you take a mile. So that's a very significant concern. Retirement, every retirement plan that has been put forth for the past 4 or 5 years, when you go back to look at the Defense Advisory Committee for Military Compensation proposal, the QRMC proposal, the Defense Business Board proposal, all of those entailed radical changes, way worse than the than the redux that failed. And so when you see that, I think we all get our arms, our hair on fire and say, I'm sorry, you're just starting from the wrong place. We're starting from how much money can we take out of it, when what we should be starting for is what should people earn for a career of service and sacrifice under conditions that can range anywhere up to and including deploying every other year for 10 years, or giving up your life, or coming back with PTSD and TBI, and not only your life but your family's life is going to be changed forever. Those are the kinds of things, as Congressman West said, that we believe have to be counted as the contribution. That's what people really pay in a career of service and sacrifice.
Thank you. I certainly appreciate what you're saying. I think we all do. I appreciate that. If there are things that you can offer to us, that's always helpful. Mr. Davis, I don't know if you wanted to comment further, and I had one other question.
I just wanted to, second his information, but also just to remember when looking at the retirement system, I think it's important to remember that our armed services are there to fight wars, and war is a young man's or woman's profession. And I look back at some of the stuff I did when I was in the Marines about carrying artillery shells and all that the kind of activity that you do. I probably couldn't be able to do it today. So, when you think about it, it's a young man's or woman's profession, and the retirement system should reflect that.
Thank you. If I may, just for our Department of Defense witnesses, and you can do this certainly for the record because my time is almost up, could you also help us understand where you are looking to address other increased costs and expenditures that we have in our contracted services? I'd like to know what we're doing about that, because the concern, of course, is that we're looking here at retirement benefits and other benefits to the military, and yet we see that despite the fact that perhaps you're trying to look at some of those costs, at the same time, we're maybe doing away with some services from our civilian personnel that we'd have to go back and then contract with the outside. And I'd like to know where what else you're doing. How are you going about addressing those issues? So we're talking about costs across the board, and I know in response to one of the other questions, you did say this is not the only thing we're looking at, of course, but I'd like to know how you're going about that and how far along we are in looking at a lot of the contracted services that also cost us a great deal of money. Thank you very much.
Certainly. We will take that for the record given our time. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you very much. And during our whole debate, I was impressed several times it was referenced about military families. And as we're looking into the issues of retirement, the military families truly are of service and sacrifice. And I just hope that every effort's made to work with military families and get their input, because they really truly sacrifice so much, but they're counting on a very positive career, very fulfilling career for their spouses and for themselves. A question that I would have is for Colonel Strobridge and Mr. Davis: has the Department of Defense consulted with your organizations, Fleet Reserve, MOA, and what is, or have they consulted with other military organizations and associations for their input on this issue of retirement reform?
Not to date, no, sir. I think there are probably people who would prefer that they didn't.
Well, I hope, and Mr. Davis, your view?
Yeah, we have not been contacted by them for our input.
Well, I certainly know what a resource you can be, and so I hope that you would be contacted. And I know how broad-based both of your organizations are, and I pay dues to ROA and some others too. So American Legion comes to mind, BFW, so retiree organizations active, and I just know that they would give heartfelt, real-world examples firsthand of the consequence of any reform effort. I'd like to proceed to Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was in the military, in the Army on active duty during the first, reduction in force that I can remember, which was in the early 1970s, post-Vietnam. Unfortunately, there was no separation pay as was in the early 1990s post-Gulf War, and that reduction in force where I think they gave a lump sum payment to separating, I think, senior non-commissioned officers and officers who were forced out in that process. And I think that what is stressful for that population in a reduction in force is that there's no understanding of what the system is going to be until they receive, pretty much until they receive notice that they're going to be out. Then there may be a decision that will help them, and there may not, and that's unfortunate. And I think that's one reason why I think it's important to have a reform that reflects some accrued retirement benefit for people less than 20 years. And I think that's something that it's important to watch out for. And then I also, and certainly I want to reiterate again, that I think that whatever system we put in place should not impact the people currently on active duty. With that, Mr. Chairman, unless are there any responses from the panel to what I just said?
I would just comment, sir, that the separation pays that you're talking about, at least as far as the law is concerned, those are deemed, we don't think that's right, but when you look at the law, it's hard to come to any conclusion that it's deemed a kind of retired pay payment. If you take that and then come back in the service and qualify for retirement, they're going to deduct that separation pay from your retired pay. So we don't like that, but that's the way it is. So in other words, under current law, that is the retired pay outlay. the separation pay.
And just one final point, and that is that on active duty in the Army and the Marine Corps, I served in combat arms. Except for my last tour in Iraq was civil affairs, but Gulf War I was light army infantry officer, and then I was mechanized infantry in the United States Army. And I got to tell you that that pretty much wore me out, and I think to the casual observer, they'll verify that it is a there's such a wide disparity in occupations in the military. And I got to tell you, there are a lot of them that people show up to work in the morning and leave in the afternoon, and it's not a whole lot different than quite frankly, a civilian job. And there are those jobs that are just tough. And I believe that if we can't recognize that in retirement, we ought to recognize it in plussing up hazardous duty pay, plussing up sea duty pay, and all those other things to recognize people that don't punch out on Saturday, on Friday afternoon to go home, and just you know, go day after day after day. And I've done that in theater, in war twice, and it's tough stuff. And so I think we need to recognize that. Certainly, I appreciate everybody's service in the United States military, but I also appreciate that there are differences. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And Congressman Heck. No further questions. And Colonel West. My goodness, Colonel. And Congressman Scott of Georgia. Ms. Davis, any further? There being no further, thank all of you for being here. You could tell the high interest and appreciation for your service. And again, military families, what we're talking about are consequences far beyond today, and we're looking for a very strong and positive future. The meeting is adjourned.